Good afternoon. I'm Kelly Darnell, and I'd like to welcome you to the fifth and final day of the 2020 Bipartisan Policy Center Solution Summit. For nearly 15 years, the Bipartisan Policy Center has combined ideas and interests from across the political spectrum to promote pragmatic and durable policy. The pandemic and recent social unrest revealed key weaknesses in the American society and economy. As we look for solutions, there's a fierce urgency of pragmatism. We know that the recent election results reinforce the view that engaging a diversity of views to address these issues is the best and only path forward. Over the past 4 days of our summit, we focused on promoting financial resilience and wealth creation, supporting work and expanding opportunity, and helping children and families. This week, we focused on the challenges for the American people and listened to the experts. BPC will be there to help the new administration and Congress to find solutions to America's challenges. We're all in this together. For our fifth and final session, we've partnered with the Smithsonian Institution and Bank of America to address racial equity as we confront America's racial past and take steps towards healing. This is a moment of opportunity. This fall, the Smithsonian launched the Race, Community, and Our Shared Future initiative, a commitment to the nation during a time of tremendous change. The Smithsonian's initiative will focus on inequity and social justice, providing context and tools for individuals to explore their personal experiences of and relationship to race. To kick us off, I'd like to introduce Jason Grumet, CEO of the Bipartisan Policy Center, who'll lead a discussion with Dr. Raj Shah, CEO of the Rockefeller Foundation and former administrator of USAID. They'll focus on the economic impact of the pandemic on communities of color. The final panel will consider some of the structural issues that bear on race and equity with the focus on how we build a coalition that can raise up and create communities for all Americans. Today, we're pleased to be joined for that discussion with Secretary Lonnie Bunch, Secretary Henry Cisneros, and Governor John Kasich, who will talk about how we move forward. Jason?
Well, Raj, good to see you, my friend. Lots to talk about, so let's just jump right in. As you know as well as anyone, the pandemic has laid bare and amplified some really crucial racial inequities, both in terms of economics, but also public health. And I thought we could just start out, Dr. Shaw, talking a little bit about public health and help us understand just the kind of unsettling, shocking statistic that Black Americans have been 2.5 times more likely to die from the COVID virus than white Americans. I mean, what does that reveal about public health in the United States?
Well, it's great to be with you, Jason, and congratulations on an extraordinarily important solution summit that the Bipartisan Policy Center is hosting right now. You're right to point out that this is first and foremost a public health crisis. It seems like when we look at how we're spending resources these days, it's easy to forget that. And within the context of the public health crisis, this is absolutely first and foremost a crisis about lower income and minority populations. The African American community, as you point out, is 2.5 times more likely to suffer significant consequences and mortality related to COVID. 1 in 1,000 Black Americans have died already from COVID. The number one risk of being in a nursing home today is being African American. So the reality is this has had a very focused and much more significant impact. And as a result, from a public health perspective, what we should be doing is driving what we call a deeply equitable response. We should be focusing first and foremost on the highest risk communities, which are low-income, minority, and essential workers. We should make sure that they have, ubiquitous access to testing, so that is fully covered and compensated, so that they know their status and can operate in their jobs in a safe and effective manner. And frankly, we should be prioritizing lower income and minority populations for access to the vaccine as that rollout happens, both because it is the equitable thing to do, but also from a public health basis, that's how you get the biggest reduction in transmissibility, or R naught, which is what ultimately drives the disease downward and keeps us all safe.
So just to pick up on that, because I think it's a really important insight. How do we as a country actually pull that off, right? How do we reverse the kind of embedded public health bias, just in terms of access to healthcare generally, when it comes to the tough task of distributing a vaccine?
Well, you're 100% right that there's an embedded bias. And we see it not just in access to medical facilities, we see it in whether you have and trust and communicate effectively with your doctor. And we ultimately see it in data that shows that as many as half of all minorities in America, have a propensity not to trust the vaccine and its safety. So what we're going to have to do is really focus on deep community engagement. We're going to need pastors and sports role models and local officials, teachers, people who are trusted in their community have to be the ones communicating the benefits and the risks related to either benefits of getting vaccinated and the risks of not getting vaccinated. And we're going to have to make access easy and safe. And frankly, it's fraught right now with fear and complexity. And that's going to require doing things we don't usually do. We spend $4 trillion in American healthcare, and we focus on tertiary care and expensive institutions. We have to reinvest in public health. And this effort to vaccinate all Americans, starting with those who are highest risks and in an equitable manner, can actually be a way to reshape the American public health system for decades to come if we get it right. So that's the hope. But it's going to require using tools that we don't usually deploy in our public health toolbox, and recognizing that this can't just be left to doctors and health officials. This has to be, an all of society effort to make sure everyone has access and trust and gets the vaccine.
So Raj, you always have a knack for seeing kind of opportunity in crisis. I like the idea that this could be kind of a restart to America's focus on public health infrastructure, which we agree has been fundamentally underinvested in. So let's now start to turn the question over to economics, which is the larger focus of today's session. As I think you know as well as I, there has been a growing structural wealth gap in this country. In fact, the average Black family roughly has about 1/10 the wealth of the average white family. And unfortunately, the pandemic has made things worse. Work that we've done together reveals that, Black and Hispanic families are 2 times as likely to have lost jobs or wages, and 2 times as likely to have missed a significant bill, a mortgage, a rental payment, a utility bill. So I think the communities of color enter the pandemic in a weak economic posture and are going to be leaving in a weaker posture. So you've been working on that a lot. Rockefeller has focused on both local and international solutions. And if we could just, before we focus on kind of domestic federal policy, are there some examples from the research that you've done or the innovative projects you've supported at the local or international level that you think could inform the work we have to do going forward?
Well, Jason, you've articulated the challenge perfectly, and BPC has done extraordinarily important work on this. The reality is the opportunity to extend public health, vaccines, testing, basic public health access to low-income and minority communities is an opportunity to rebuild and address racial injustice in American healthcare. In the same way, the opportunity to invest in a jobs-first recovery with a focus on Black Americans, with a focus on Latino Americans, that's the way we can address economic racial injustice in American society. We're about to pass, it seems like, a $900 billion package that is part of a recovery. We keep hearing that that's one step forward. We know that more needs to be on the way. The way these resources are expended says everything about whether we're serious or not about addressing the racial injustices that COVID-19 has not just sort of shown us and illustrated, but frankly has exacerbated because of its own propensities to have bigger consequences for minorities in particular. So yeah, we see lots of opportunities. I mean, we have a project in Baltimore where we've created a Baltimore Health Corps that focuses on getting public health access out to minority communities, African-American communities. We're studying that with Johns Hopkins to demonstrate that that's actually going to help have a faster economic recovery and a bigger impact on disease transmissibility by focusing outreach on Black Americans. We have projects in north of 20 cities around America where we help Black and brown-owned businesses get access to capital. We know that PPP and the way it was implemented preferences those larger firms that have more of a historic relationship with big banks, and that systematically excludes many small businesses and most Black and brown-owned businesses. So you need a specific effort to focus on capital access for those businesses, both to get through the crisis and to rebuild their business afterwards. And we've seen models across the country work in that regard. We've worked with you and others to expand access to the Earned Income Tax Credit and make the refundable child tax credit a more innovation-oriented tool to provide working capital, just resources to people who desperately need it for whatever they need it for. And we know that that is probably the single greatest healthcare and anti-poverty program for minority Americans in this country. But so much more could be done to expand eligibility for single individuals who should have access, to change the way the payment structure is made so that it's more regular and less of a one-time effort on an annual basis, and to make enrollment more automatic using digital tools. Those are all things we're doing with partners, and we see extraordinary results on poverty, on childcare, on early childhood education, and on healthcare access by doing those practical and focused efforts. And it's our hope that going forward, these examples of success get picked up and scaled by the federal government.
So, as you indicated, right, the purpose of our Solution Summit is to really try to kind of highlight the urgency and the possibility of some early legislative success next year. And you just identified, I think, a number of important topics. But let me ask you to kind of reflect on, the strategic conversation we are having with everyone we know, which is this, challenge between kind of, bold versus pragmatic, right? We didn't have a blue wave. People jokingly say we had a blue puddle. We have an incredibly closely divided government. How do you think about the, ambition of big structural change versus the kind of immediacy of putting some quick wins on the board? What's the portfolio that you would like to see a Biden administration approach in terms of huge challenges and a real need to kind of rebuild legislative function and public trust?
Well, I think my answer is really what the Bipartisan Policy Center stands for. It's the fact that we should focus on what's possible and recognize that if we're data-driven and we focus on what brings us together as opposed to what divides us, we can actually get a lot done and reshape the nature of opportunity for tens of millions of American families. All of the solutions I just described, from the EITC and CTC to programs to recapitalize Black and brown-owned businesses, to an effort to have an equity-first mindset in everything from public health communications to testing access and vaccine distribution, are all practical, pragmatic, data-driven ways to solve the problem we're facing, which is fundamentally a public health crisis that has then caused a major economic crisis that for the bottom 60% of American households has been devastating. It hasn't been devastating for the very top and people who have lots of access to the resources in equity markets, for example. It's been fine, but for most American working families, it's been devastating. Whether you are in a red state or a blue state, or whether you are in a rural community and voted for Donald Trump, or an urban community and voted for Joe Biden. Either way, the proposals we're talking about are the things that are like kitchen table issues that make your life more viable, that allow you to be more hopeful for your children's future, and that should, especially as we look at states and how they're behaving, that should have bipartisan support, and therefore should be a part of the sort of stimulus and recovery actions that are taken at a federal level.
Well, Raj, you have exceptionally demonstrated why we so enjoy and appreciate the partnership with you and your colleagues, and have also done a tremendous job kind of setting up the next conversation that we are going to have right now. So thank you again for your time. Appreciate everything you all do. And I think now we're going to turn to the second panel for today's discussion. It is a real honor to close down our weeks-long Solution Summit with a a conversation with three folks who I just have the deepest respect for. Really appreciate so much Secretary Cisneros, Governor Kasich, Secretary Bunch, for you joining us today to talk about a important and challenging topic, which is how we advance a kind of collaborative, hopefully bipartisan agenda for racial equity in a closely divided government. If I can, just as a point of personal privilege, each of you have longstanding relationships with the BPC, and we're going to talk about issues that are obviously policy relevant, but also really personal. And so I hope I can have the latitude of dispensing with the honorifics, and for the next 30 or 45 minutes, have a conversation among Jason, Lonnie, John, and Henry. As I indicate, we're going to lean into some real policy questions, because the specific issue for the BPC is, how do we make real progress, recognizing we have a divided country? How do we move from having positions to actually having policies? But before kind of leaning into the specifics, I think I want to start off by just asking each of you probably an unfairly broad question, just to situate the discussion. And Lonnie, if I can start with you. You probably more than anybody I know has insight into just the kind of history of our nation's successes and failures as we move towards a better union. I will tell you that at times I take a lot of solace in the idea that while progress is slow, it's kind of inexorable. But I got to tell you, the last couple of years, the arc of moral justice has been bending all over the place. And so I wonder if, just from a kind of a historic perspective, just where are we as a country, and how do you think about these issues of racial wealth gap and basic equity can, over the course of the last, just 300 or 400 years, take as much time as you need?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that this issue of what you call a wealth gap, I call a fairness gap, this issue has really been around as long as America's been a country. What you realize is that people of color, whether it's Chinese laborers or African Americans working in the fields, what they've really done is they've contributed mightily to the economic opportunities of America. They have really been the vital engine to stimulate change and growth. But they've also been a group of people who have really not reaped the benefits of their work, have not really found the fairness in the work that they've done. And I think for me, as a historian of Black America, obviously you can start with slavery. You could sort of argue that slavery was the economic engine of 19th century America, transformed this nation from both an agrarian society to an industrial one. And that in many ways, the amount of money involved with slavery at the dawn of the Civil War was more than the amount of money invested in banks, railroads, and commerce combined. So it is really crucial to understand that that engine changed the nation, but it was also an engine that sort of set the African American community back. Is that what you see is coming out of slavery is the birth of Jim Crow. You see government policies in the 20th century that lead to redlining. You see Black communities destroyed when highways go through. What you see is economic policies that prevent fairness. You also see racial discrimination, racial violence. You look at what happened in Tulsa in 1921, where here was a community that was known as the Black Wall Street, was destroyed because of the economic challenges that it was facing with the white community. So in many ways, what's clear is that this is a long-standing challenge in America, and therefore it's going to take a lot of creativity and a long-standing commitment to be able to affect the change that will get us to a more fair economy.
Thank you, Lonnie. So, John, I'm going to turn it to you, and that's probably an unfair question. You've been incredibly consistent in publicly condemning what have been the divisive statements from this president and many others over the last months and years. But not a whole lot of Republican elected officials have done the same, which has led some people to kind of question core values in the party. Others, and I'll put myself in the other category, read it more as just a reluctance among elected officials on the Republican side to separate themselves from the president in any regard. But I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about where you see this dynamic, and where does the party of Lincoln find itself as we transition away from a Trump presidency? And what do you imagine is going to be the conversation going forwards?
Well, I mean, first of all, the Republican Party has been my vehicle and not my master any time in my career. I was elected very early at the age of 26 to the legislature. I ran a grassroots campaign. The party helped me, but it was sort of the people that work with me, the grassroots activity that got me there. And I was elected in '82. Sort of the same thing, big grassroots campaign. Never went into public life thinking that I owed anybody anything except the people that were the volunteers that went out in the streets and helped me. We really created the definition of grassroots campaigning here in the state. And then as governor, it was great that I was a Republican governor and all that. And I owe the Republican Party an allegiance because they gave me an opportunity, but they've been my vehicle and not my master. As you all know, I did not, maybe you don't know, I didn't go to the Republican convention the last time in 2016 because I kind of felt we were going to get what we've received. And I was kind of hopeful we wouldn't, but it turned out that way. And that convention, by the way, was held in Ohio. And so I was really well thought of in my state for not going to the convention after I helped them to secure it. And then for the last few years, I was hoping we'd see a switch, and we didn't. And then, of course, I spoke at the Democratic convention. And it wasn't because I'm a Democrat. I'm still a Republican. I did it because I felt it was important for me to express my concerns and my hope that Joe Biden would bring us back to a more united country. I happened to watch a little bit of the rally in Georgia on Saturday night. And I've been flabbergasted a lot, but I couldn't believe what I saw on that, at that rally and how people were cheering. And it made no sense to me what was happening there. And then I've noticed that I think it's 88% of the Republican faithful are in the Congress are unwilling to call Joe Biden the president-elect. It just makes no sense to me. So I assume we'll get through this. Why are they doing it? Cult of personality, I think, for one reason. And secondly, I think beyond that, some are afraid that his supporters will be against them. But I've talked to congressmen who have been reelected, who declared themselves independent. They did quite well and were reelected. In terms of the party, I think the party this time was able to run a lot on cultural issues, defunding the police, the drift towards socialism, and those things just revved a lot of people up. And that's what made the election so close. And you can see the Democrats themselves thinking internally about how do we communicate a message that is not connected to these things that are repelling to people who are concerned about where our country is, whether it's the police, whether it's drift towards socialism. However, for me, I've always kind of looked at what I could do to help people have more opportunity. I come from a blue-collar Democratic town outside of Pittsburgh, and it was a place where if the wind blew the wrong way, people found themselves out of work. And here's one thing that I've been thinking about. Since this is the Bipartisan Policy Center, how do you get things done? And Secretary and Henry, two secretaries we have, the double secretaries. One thing I've been thinking about is that I think you would find, and I would in no way minimize the struggle of the African American community, because I think what the secretary said was true in so many respects. Just the simple beatings that took place in order to try to create some level of civil rights. It has been a struggle and has been very tough. But I also believe that there are people who live in these abandoned factory towns, in these small towns where businesses have left, where these towns are awash in an opiate crisis, where people there feel as though they've not been given a fair chance. They don't believe that by playing by the rules, it's gotten them anywhere. And they're not just worried about themselves, but they're really worried about their children. And I think when we think about those places, and we think about the struggles in the inner cities of our country, there's something there that can unite all of those people. There's something there that they have in common. I try to play by the rules, I try to do the right thing, and I'm getting nowhere. And those are many of the people that voted for Donald Trump, because he recognized the fact that if he was a negative populist, he could anger them and unite them. I'm a positive populist, not a negative one. But I think there's an opportunity to pass legislation that would connect both groups. And you mentioned in the introduction things like the earned income tax credit, which gives people an incentive to get ahead when they go to work. The need to have a significant reform in health policy, particularly when we notice the health disparities that we see. I was the first real Republican governor to expand Medicaid so people could get help who were poor, that the mentally ill and the drug addicted could get treatment. I think healthcare policies in respect to all of those groups, both of those groups, is something that we can think about. Childcare, also to eliminate this place where if you go to work, you lose more benefits than you gain from a job. We need a fundamental reform of providing incentives for people to be able to get ahead. In workforce training, lowering the cost of higher education. There's so many things that we can do that I think can apply to both communities and allow us to make progress. But what we have to hope for, Secretary, what we have to pray for is that people will escape the partisan holds they have on themselves. And both parties have it. Both parties are stuck. To escape that and think about justice for people in the moment when you're in public office, that you're really willing to do something significant to give every American a chance to rise, to be able to get ahead, to have a better future. So I guess we could talk more about that, and I'm honored to be on this panel with you, Secretary. And Henry Cisneros, I remember when he was the rising star. You're still rising.
Still is. He's still going up.
You were rising.
Thank you, Governor.
A rising, sort of young star. I was in that category.
You have set the agenda, and I think much of what you described is consistent. We have just released this agenda for working families, which I'm sure is posted in the chat, and I think the issues you raised are a lot of what I want to get into. But just to kind of finish this stretching, I want to talk a little bit about the Latino experience. And Henry, you are a proud Texan and have deep intuitions about the experience and interests of the Latino community. A lot of folks I've spoken to up here in the North are kind of surprised at the extent to which Vice President Biden underperformed Secretary Clinton's vote tally with the Hispanic community across the country, but particularly also in Texas. And I wonder if you could just use that as an entry point to reflect on, what does that mean to you, and what does it say about just the kind of the diversity of interests in the Latino community?
Thank you, Jason, and thank you for inviting me to participate with these distinguished gentlemen, Secretary and Governor, both of whom I've admired for a long time. And Governor, like you, I have seen other people introduced as a rising star every decade for 40 years. And so let me just say quickly, the Latino community is a very diverse community. It's 55 million people strong across America, a vast variety, and the fastest growing segment of American society, going to 100 million people by probably about 2045, something like that. It'll be a quarter of the population that year when it's 100 million people. The national population will be about 400 million by that time. The reason that it's growing so fast is not so much immigration. In fact, immigration is slowed. It is that the Latino families tend to be larger, and Latinos today are vastly younger than the national population. Something like 26 years old on average versus a national population average of about 37 or so. Latinos are Mexican Americans, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Central Americans, people from the Caribbean, some from South America, and they bring with them their politics, their religion, their business acumen, educational backgrounds. And so it's a very, very diverse group. It's interesting to watch what happened in this election. It sort of speaks to the diversity. If you look at California and regard it as an almost permanently blue state, it's the large Hispanic population that assured that that would be the case. On the other hand, in this election, the Cuban vote probably delivered Florida for President Trump. It was hopeful that that would not be the case, but the Cubans really doubled down hard and on issues that are important to them, that are not important to other parts of the Hispanic community, and they elected, they delivered Florida for President Trump. Texas falls somewhere in between. Texas Hispanics have traditionally been Democrats and vote about 75% or so. I think Bill Clinton got about 76%, and that's generally been the number. But although there have been Republican candidates, Governor Kasich has probably watched them, like John Tower, who won Texas because he early on figured out the Latino community was going to be important, and he was able to win it by taking that 75 Democratic number and pushing it down to in the 60s and getting 35% of the vote. It is probable that George Bush, when he ran for governor in 1998, won the Hispanic vote, probably right at 50% or maybe even slightly more. But obviously it was doable. What happened in this election, I think, was, first of all, and the Latino community was mightily hurt over the course of the last 4 years by the president's targeting of Latinos. Lonnie is the expert on history, but it would be interesting to go back in history and find when was the last time a president in the White House targeted a group as specifically as this president did Latinos as a subgroup. I'm not being overly sensitive, just factual. He attacked DACA. He attacked a judge in San Diego who was trying a case that he was involved in just because he had a Hispanic surname. Obviously pursued the wall with the idea that it was symbolic of separating off Mexico from the United States. He attacked the idea of immigrants in cities and focused on sanctuary cities and incidents that immigrants were involved in to attack the whole community. Came down and announced for president using the word rapists and murderers about Latinos and immigrants in his opening comments. But the worst offense of all, in my opinion, was this unbelievable tragedy of separating children from their parents at the border and putting them in detention facilities. If you know anything about the Latino community, it is that we're a family-oriented community, extended families, love their children. I can't imagine a worse thing for a Latino father or mother than to have their children taken out of their arms the way policy did. This president did this. So it's perplexing why he would win the kinds of numbers that he did in Texas this time. Now, they're not huge. They didn't change dramatically what I described earlier, that sort of 70% or so Democratic tilt. But there's counties in the poorest parts of Texas down on the border that he won, a place called Starr County. And I think if you try to analyze it and understand, it was a number of things. First of all, guns. This is a country area, and hunters, just like Upper Wisconsin or Upper Michigan, they may be a blue state in most times, but guns matter in the rural areas. Secondly, it was the evangelicals have grown very important in the Latino community. And so there was a kind of a pro-life, pro-choice issue there. But I think fundamentally, Trump and his language just appealed to a certain group of Latino males who just love that macho speak, that sort of blustery kind of. There's a song that mariachis sing at family gatherings in Latinos, and it's called El Rey. And what effectively it says is, I do everything my way. I am the king. And I think a lot of Latinos believe they were hearing that song sung to them by Donald Trump. So there's a lot of things to analyze.
Hum a few bars, but let's thank you. So I want to start to turn to the questions and the issues that Governor Kasich raised. But just, Lonnie, just before we kind of dive right into the federal policy, which is so much of the Bipartisan Policy Center's focus, talk a little bit about how you see the role of government as it relates to the private sector, a lot of focus on racial equity and private industry. And then also, you always describe yourself as like, Lonnie from the neighborhood, right? What are the community-based aspects as we think about what a solution needs to look like?
Well, I think first of all, I thought, Governor, you raised the right issue, which is you have so many people who no longer believe in the dream of America, who feel that they were left out. You see African Americans feeling they've been demonized by this president as well. You have people who, when I go into many high schools in the inner city, who tell me, why should I worry about education? Because I'm not going to have the future that you've had. And I think that what the governor raises is the real challenge to say, how do you realize that we can bring people together if we can help make people believe? If we can help people understand that as bad as the struggle has been, there has been, I think, great progress. To be perfectly honest, I'm the head of the Smithsonian. That doesn't happen 10 years ago. That doesn't happen 20 years ago. And I think more importantly, you see more people who are saying there are opportunities to sort of create businesses that are trying to sort of give the African American community hope. And I think that challenge of hope is really the key. I also think, though, what's really important is recognizing that this is an opportunity, maybe a tipping point, to see an activist government, but also to see really a public-private partnership, to see the government and the corporate community look at how do we address this wage gap? How do we address the challenge of education? How do we address the challenge of unfair housing? I think this is a real opportunity where I think there are people who are willing to cross lines they didn't cross before. I must admit, my optimism is tempered by the fact that so many people voted for Donald Trump, because I thought that in many ways there would be people who would say, this is not the America I believe in. And I think the challenge for us all is to find ways, tell people believe in this country again, tell people believe that it's possible to be a great nation, but to be a nation that is also fair.
Lonnie, let me just jump in here for a second. And that's Lonnie, that is exactly why I raised the issue of these people who come from these abandoned factory towns, places like Youngstown, Ohio, or the small towns where, you remember that book, Hillbilly Elegy. That didn't involve many African Americans, I don't believe, but it's the same feeling. So how do you get it done? Well, you connect the groups. So I made a couple notes here about, let's talk about the earned income tax credit. I cut taxes here in Ohio for those at the top. I wanted to get our income tax down so we could get some of those Texas jobs back. But at the same time I did that, I created the first earned income tax credit and fought for that back in the days when I was in the Congress, where they tried to get rid of that. And I said, no way, because that gives people a reason to work. Childcare is a big issue. I mean, what we tried to do here was to try to figure out a way that people who were dependent on the government would have an incentive to be able to go out. And if their childcare costs were through the roof, they couldn't go because they were losing more. And in fact, as they made more money, they ended up losing some of their benefits. We dealt with that. That applies to everyone. This child care issue is an issue that I should have been on years ago. We tried it as governor, but it's a big deal. Of course, to health care. And that's something that affects all Americans, because if you take a look at the rising costs of co-payments, whatever, you get less, you pay more for less these days. And particularly for those who are poor, who don't have the resources, they forego getting treated. And if you're sick, it's pretty hard to go to work. Let's talk about education for a second. What we did here, I believe this is a key, that everybody who's run for president, Henry, in the last 100 years talks about education, but we never know what they really mean by it or what's going to be effective. What we did here is, if you went to high school, you got college credit while you were in high school. It could significantly reduce the cost of higher education. We allowed these community colleges. We put them in a position of where you got credit for going to them. You go to them for 3 years before you get your degree at a 4-year university. You don't even need to go to that 4-year university, but it reduces the cost dramatically. The other thing we did is we created competency-based education. So if you're a mom with a couple kids working at McDonald's, if you can get to a library or if you have a computer, you can take courses and you can improve yourself. So for example, right now in my private sector work, we're working with a company that online can give people the skills of being able to understand some basic level technology, whether it's coding, whether it's an entry into AI or machine learning or digital marketing. And let me tell you how that's going. We're going to people now who are on relief, people who are dependent on the government, and we're now giving them the tools to actually acquire value. And they can do it at their own speed. And in fact, if these organizations will actually train people, I mean, this is real. This is not some government job that never exists or some silly train. This is the real deal. And let's talk about for example, the nonviolent offenders. I mean, we tried to release a bunch of them, and we also said we banned the box. So if you go to apply for a job, they ask you, did you ever commit a felony? And it doesn't matter what it was. If the answer is yes, you never get anywhere. Well, we banned the box so that people had to give people interviews to see who they are. All of those things are things that can be supported on a bipartisan basis, where you can actually make some progress on this stuff, because we are now beginning to hook the communities of rural America and abandoned urban America, along with those who live in the inner cities of our country. And I just think these are some practical things that we can do, because it's all about justice, right? At the end, guys, at the end of the day, we're going to answer questions to our maker, and he's going to say, what did you do with what I gave you? And if your answer is, well, I was really a good Republican, that's not going to cut it. So Governor, you guys have together.
Jason, let me
so
just
you
say,
have laid out the vision of what a kind of bipartisan agenda can look like. And Henry, you may have been going here, so I'm sorry to interrupt you, but one of the things we haven't talked about yet is housing policy. And I think we have a real fear of a tremendous unraveling of that just basic foundation. And I wonder if you, in addition to whatever else you were going to say, could speak to that a little bit.
Well, before we get to housing policy, and I will briefly, let me just say, we are in an especially tough time because I really believe from what I have seen, and by the way, the neighborhood that I live in my grandparents' old home is called the poorest census tract in San Antonio. So the people that I live with, go to the grocery store with, go to church with, are very poor people. And this pandemic has been more impactful than I think we know, and more than we don't fully understand what is going to transpire here. It's going to be worse yet, as some of these programs end and are not replenished, and evictions come into play, and this has been very, very severe, and it's been really hard on people of color. I saw numbers the other day for Detroit, where in certain counties of Michigan, the African American population is 14%, but the death is 40% of all the deaths. In New York, for a long span of time, the Latino community had the largest number of people hospitalized, and it's all a function of the jobs that they were in. These are people who were called essential workers, and what that essentially meant is you can't work from home. You have to be on the job, processing the food or repairing the cars or providing transportation for other people, etc. And so on top of the normal structural problems, the pandemic has created its own issues. And I would say that the first job of the new administration has to be focus on dealing with the problems created by the pandemic and the economic consequences that came from it. So this $900 billion short-term CARES initiative is important. It's got to be done. And then there's got to be a serious infrastructure or other kind of stimulus in the early months, because I think we really, they're calling it the pandemic recession, and some aspects of the pandemic recession numerically are as serious as 2008, and in others it's actually worse than 2008. Quickly, a few words on housing. We've got an affordability crisis in the country. We had it before the pandemic. There isn't a single metropolitan area in America where a person earning the minimum wage can afford the rent on a 2-bedroom apartment. You just can't on a minimum wage. And it's getting worse. And so the focus has to be on affordable rentals as well as affordable entry-level home ownership. Rentals so people can have a decent place to live and gather their lives and take care of their children, give them a place to study and be healthy, and entry-level home ownership because it is the entry port to the middle class. It is how people develop some net worth, is to pay the equity, pay toward the equity on a home. And those are both critical national priorities that have to be addressed. We cannot let the progress we were making on this agenda before be completely detoured by the pandemic, because cities had funds that they were working on to do affordable housing, and they had to pull out money out of those funds to feed people in food lines and provide some kind of assistance for people who otherwise would be evicted. We're off track right now, and we've got to get back on track to this critical national agenda that has everything to do with not just income, but wealth, as people own something in their home.
Yeah.
But I think what's so important that you both have said is that this needs national attention, right? That in essence, what is our New Deal of today, right? What is our great society? But what is it done in a way that is a public-private partnership? Because I think that's really the key. I worry so much about the very people the governor was talking about that are going to be left behind. And unless we're really willing to seize this and make it a national priority and put the resource and the creativity to bear, otherwise, this is going to be a 20-year drag, and many people are going to be lost.
So the three of you have all
It's going to be a 20-year drag. It's going to be a long drag. I think that's right. And I think that President-elect Biden would do the country a great service for which he would be forever appreciated if he focused on pulling us out of this immense crisis that we're in. It will take at least the full 4 years to do it. And if he does it with full focus, and if he does it effectively, that will be his legacy. And it'll be as strong a legacy as presidents who brought us through very difficult times. Some of our greatest presidents, Lonnie, as you know from your studies, are those who inherited tough situations and brought the country through them.
And who made hard decisions, but who recognized their job was to make it better for America, for the people who get left behind. The great presidents recognize that I need to pull them with me. And I think the challenge for President-elect Biden is to say, how do I make sure that I'm making the structural changes at the top, but I'm making sure those that have been left out are with me as well.
The hard thing to know is what structural changes are needed in a time when the economy is changing, the technology is changing, the global relations are changing. It's not just to repeat what Franklin Roosevelt did, right, or even what Lyndon Johnson did, or even what Ronald Reagan did when he inherited a bad economy, but what is needed for these times. That's the hard question.
But I think what is needed, and for me, the issue is it's really about leadership, right? It's about recognizing that we're going to have to think of new answers to old problems. That even though these are issues that have been around for hundreds of years and they've been accelerated and aggravated by the pandemic, the reality is that we need new thinking and new leadership. But I want a leader that says this is a major initiative that's going to take on, like the New Deal or the Great Society, for us to move forward.
I think a big part of it has to be revolve around training and education.
Mm-hmm. So in order to get to do this, though, you have to be able to you have to grow this from the center out. Right now, there's too much dominance on the edges in, and that doesn't work for either party, whether it's on the right or whether it's on the hard left. So right now, of course, if you are somewhere in the middle, you're treated as a traitor to those on the left. And if you're saying that Donald Trump lost the election, you're treated like a traitor on the right. Well, you know what? You can't spend your time on social media trying to make sure you're popular. I mean, the reason why I think the election, first of all, it wasn't as close as what we think. I mean, it's very rare for a president not to get a second term. Bush didn't get one, I think, because of Perot. The only other one I can think of right now in my lifetime, of course, was Jimmy Carter. So remember, Donald Trump lost this election by the same amount in which Hillary Clinton lost the election. It was just a reversal. But the key is to find that middle ground. And I'm listening to Henry, for example, and you, Lonnie, and I'm saying, okay, guys like that, people like that, women like that, both for you guys and on the more center right side, together making recommendations to where we can reach agreement. And I've been involved in so many negotiations, including balancing the budget. Which you think about that today, it seems like that was a fantasy. We never did it. Well, we did do it. And there are ways in which you can pull the country together, but you can't be dominated by the extremes.
Yeah.
That will not work.
I'm optimistic on that score, Governor, because Biden's wanted to be president for his whole life, and at once upon a time he thought he'd be president because he was charismatic, or because he spoke well, or because he was handsome, or who knows what. But what actually got him elected president is he's just basically a decent person of the reasonable center. And if he just is himself, if he's just himself, in my experience over the years, leadership moves the needle. And if he just establishes that, just plays to his own natural inherent persona and strengths and soul, I think the country will gravitate to the center you described.
I think that's right, but I'm just talking about the practicality. I was both a legislator and an executive, and I can tell you that you need to have good advice. And you can't get advice from just one quarter or the other, or be afraid of plowing forward and doing what you know in your heart and soul is the right thing to do. And look, I went to the Democratic convention and endorsed Joe Biden. There was a reason for that, because I thought that everything you said is true about him. But how are they going to move this? How are they going to be able to connect people and get, for example, the Republicans to have an attitude of, this is going to be a one-term president, he's not going to be successful, we're not going to go along? I mean, how do you avoid that? Is it possible to avoid it? Yeah, I think if you can get enough coalitions of people together who say, knock it off. To the Democrats, you say, don't be crazy out here with your extremes. To the Republicans, you say, don't be an obstructionist. But I think having people who can come together to provide good, solid advice to the president, who are not in the government, people who are outside the government. I mean, listen to what Lonnie's saying. I can make a deal with Lonnie every day of the week. I hope he just lets me in the building sometime when I go back to Washington. But no, the same with you. These are reasonable approaches, but somehow the people that are in, not all of them, you got that problem solvers caucus or whatever, but you have a lot of people that if they step out of line, they get whacked by the extremes on one side or the other. You can't pay attention to that. You got to do what you think is right.
What you say is true. What you say is true. And yet we have an example in front of us right now where a $900 billion package is being considered seriously for action, maybe by the end of the week. That is far less than what the Democrats wanted at 2.2 trillion. And it's going to include things that the Republicans never wanted, like some assistance to state and local government and such. So here's an emergency that is bringing to the fore a compromise, a bipartisan compromise.
Lonnie, can I ask you to share a final thought, and then I have a couple of wrap-up suggestions.
I mean, I think that as a historian, I am always hopeful, if not optimistic. I believe very strongly that the notion of finding that common ground has been really the key throughout our history, and it really is the key to our future. I think that what I feel strongly about is people have to recognize both that this is a long history, and so therefore we're not raising new issues. There's nothing wrong with talking candidly about racism, discrimination, but also adding that to the sense of how do we come together as a nation? How do we find that common ground that allow us to become that more perfect union? And for me, that aspiration is always why I am hopeful.
So can I just say that I knew this panel was going to be a continual motion machine. our ambition was to have kind of a capstone to the last 5 days. I think, Governor Kasich, your suggestion, don't be crazy, don't be an obstructionist. That's pretty much kind of the BPC tagline. I think to the extent that the three of you have really anchored the premise of this kind of working family agenda about being more than simply playing to one edge or the other, but trying to kind of find those common interests, particularly in a national crisis. I do believe, as you've all suggested, that it is this agenda focusing on the struggles of real people, and unfortunately, most of the country is struggling right now, that actually does create this kind of opportunity to grow a coalition that could be both powerful and durable. The purpose of our Solutions Summit was to start to kind of plant a flag for that coalition. And with the three of your leadership, and I think the many hundreds of people who have participated, I too share the optimism that we can take some real action to start to make the country a better place. As we conclude this week-long Solutions Summit, I'd like to just take a moment again to thank the dozens of speakers who have contributed their time and thoughts and ambitions and challenges to the Bipartisan Policy Center and to the nation. And also just spend a couple of minutes talking about what lies ahead. As we enter this holiday season, we of course first have to acknowledge that millions of Americans are mourning the loss of a family member, loved one, or friend. And many millions more are entering the holiday season in a state of economic deprivation and tremendous anxiety that's just not okay in the wealthiest and greatest nation in the world. And so we are committed to thinking about what we can do as an organization to move this nation forward. I think it is with some pride that I will argue that the country needs the Bipartisan Policy Center, and with even greater humility, I acknowledge that the Bipartisan Policy Center needs all of you. This is an ambition about democracy. It is a premise that despite all that divides us, there is a depth of compassion, national pride, patriotism, and rational self-interest that can create kind of a bedrock of ideas for the country to build on together. We face a public health crisis, we face an economic crisis, and we face a crisis in democracy. And that is what the Bipartisan Policy Center aims to address. We are really appreciative of all the collaboration we have had over the last many years. We urge everyone to have a wonderful holiday, rest up. We're going to need to get to work together early next year. So thank you again. And finally, I want to thank my colleagues and the staff at the BPC who heroically were able to put together 5 great events in 5 days. And so thank you all. Take care.